Hello class, Tom Simmons coming to you from my home in Chester, Vermont. Sitting in my living room with my favorite hat on that I probably wear just about every single day. And I bought it at a local leather goods store here in Chester. It's Australian in styling. In fact, it's called Aussie Outback. And if I look at the tag inside the hat, my Aussie Outback hat, purchased in Chester, Vermont, was made in Pakistan. And I relate that because the topic of today's video is globalization and how that affects you as a business. Now, globalization, if we just look at it at a very brief definition of it, is the notion that goods, services, capital, meaning investment money, and labor are crossing international borders with an ever-increasing frequency. And every business and every person is affected by that globalization. And I would argue that overall, that's a good thing. And let me give you an example from maybe your own life as to why this is so critical to permit this free flow of goods across borders. The clothes you're wearing, you didn't make. Now, if you had to, I suppose you could raise your own sheep and shear them and card the wool and clean it and then make yarn out of it by using a spinning wheel and then knit your own clothes. And I suppose that if you wanted to have hamburger for dinner tonight, then a couple years ago you could have started raising your own beef cattle and slaughtering them and producing meat. The reality is you do not have the skills or the time and the resources to make everything that you want and need in your daily life. What you do is you do what you do best. And it might be waiting on tables, working in an accountant's office, or working in a manufacturing plant. You do what's most efficient for you, and then you use the money you make, your pay, your salary, to purchase the goods and services that you need or want from other people who do it more efficiently than you do. That is the basis of economic development and trade. You do what makes sense, what's efficient, and then you use your income to trade for those goods that someone else does better than you do. If you take that personal example and explode it on a global level, you really have the basis for international trade. Not everybody does everything equally well. Maine can grow blueberries, but they can't grow avocados. Mexico can grow avocados, but they can't raise blueberries. So you do what you do best, and then you trade your excess to get goods from other places. And that's why when I get up in the morning, I throw off blankets that were made in China. And I stumble into the kitchen and I put Colombian coffee into my German-made coffee maker so I can get my eyes open in the morning. And maybe I check my Finnish or Japanese-made phone before I go into my Scandinavian hot tub on the deck. All of us are surrounded by goods that have come from somewhere else, or were touched by the international trade system. And in recent years, especially with the advent of the internet, we've had more and more trade across borders, even when the government has said we don't want that trade to happen. The United States doesn't permit, legally, the importation of Cuban cigars. And yet, probably anyone in America can obtain a Cuban cigar by doing a little diligent search on the internet and having that package come across the border. Only 1 in 200 packages ever gets inspected by Customs and Border Police. So, in spite of government efforts to restrict what comes across borders, it happens. That is the nature of society today. Now, what does that mean for you as a small business? The globalization of our economies has created great opportunities and great challenges for every small business, regardless of the size and scope of your business. First, you can expand your markets globally. You might have a local store downtown, but the internet enables you to sell your goods to people who want them across the world in a way that is unprecedented. Your market is now Earth. You've got enormous growing economies in China, India, South Africa, Brazil. And this permits you to engage in economic activity that a century ago you couldn't even have thought of. Of course, the opposite is true. Companies from those countries are also your competitors. But there are ways to deal with that, to address that. It also enables you to import raw materials cheaper than ever before, because you can do a search globally as to where to obtain the raw materials that you need to make the goods and services that you're making. And yes, a lot of our raw materials, a lot of our the inputs that we use for American businesses come from China, come from Pakistan, come from other places. That enables you as a business to lower your cost and then become more competitive in the American marketplace as you sell these goods and services. And that's good for consumers, because it means consumers are now exposed to a wider variety of goods and services from more places at lower prices, and their dollar goes further because they can buy more things. Now, you can take the opposite approach and say, I am going to launch a Buy American campaign. My company only uses American labor and American products and American inputs. And that's a perfectly legitimate approach to selling your good or service. What it means is that you will have a value-added product, because there are people who are willing to pay more for a good that bears that type of marketing. So one way you could meet the challenge of globalization is to get your raw materials from around the world inexpensively, or go the opposite direction and say, I'm just going to use American, but I'm going to really push that in my marketing and charge a premium price for it as a result of that. Many places around the world have met the challenge of globalization through the creation of what we call business clusters. And these sometimes happen just naturally and organically without planning, and sometimes they happen as a result of a specific effort to do so. A business cluster is a geographic location where a number of businesses, many of whom compete with each other, get together and establish a presence. You may have heard it said that if you want to open up a successful restaurant, open it up in a city or a town or a location where there are already 3 or 4 or 5 successful restaurants. Why? Because that location gets a reputation in the public's mind as the place you want to go to if you want to go out to dine. As important as that is the fact that the supply chains become much more efficient. For instance, I had a restaurant in a very rural part of New Hampshire, and we got most of our produce from one company. But that company told us they could only deliver 1 day a week because that was the only time they were passing through there. On the other hand, if that restaurant had been located in a city or a town where there were many other such restaurants all using that supplier would be there every day. And so you can shorten the time for deliveries of goods and services. Examples of business clusters, and you probably have heard of most of these: the financial district of Manhattan, the garment district of Manhattan, the Silicon Valley in California, There's a manufacturing cluster in Guadalajara, Mexico. There's a tech cluster in Seoul, South Korea. There are call center clusters in India. What this does is it enables those businesses to encourage suppliers of their businesses to also set up shop in town. And the time between ordering something you need and getting it is almost instantaneous. And that enables you to compete with a global economy that takes time for goods and services to be moved from place to place. Now, you may say, well, I don't have these grandiose plans. I'm just a small local business. I intend to conduct my business with people passing by my storefront on the street. So how does globalization affect me? Well, if you want to go into the restaurant business, globalization affected you when we went from a Mexican food trend to an Indian food trend to a sushi food trend. You want to open up a daycare center? Globalization has led to immigration, which means there's a really good chance that someone in your daycare center is going to be from a culture that you never even have run into before. And that impacts the relationship you have with your potential client, their culture, and how you deal with their child. There are far more, let's say, Somali and Syrian refugees right now in the United States, everywhere, than there were 10 years ago. If you think, well, I'm only going to open up a salon, a hair and nail salon, so what does globalization have to do with me? Well, it has to do with the importing of the products you're going to use in your customers, and it also affects the trends that are going to take place in the fashion industry and the beauty industry as to what people want from you. Opening up a game store? Well, everyone who ever had a game store knows that the Pokemon craze took over for a while. Globalization affects everyone, even if you're saying to yourself, well, I only want a small business in my local community, because we're all affected by it. Now, of course, once you decide how you are going to deal with the effects and the impacts and the challenges and the opportunities of a global economy, there is the big unknown factor as to what is government going to do to make this easier or to screw up the plans that I actually have put in place. Little bit of a historic overview here. Back at the time of World War I and World War II, there was not much international trade. Many nations were kind of hunkered down with what we call hard borders, in believing that they should try and make everything themselves and not engage in much trade with the outside world. Japan was an isolationist nation right up until World War II. But as I started this video out with, just as you cannot build your house and build your own car and raise your own food and make your own clothes, no nation can do everything. You simply don't have the time and resources to do everything at once. After World War II, the nations of the world got together and started down a path towards encouraging trade and globalization. It started with a general agreement on trade and tariffs called GATT, which was really it was simply a statement. It was a philosophical statement along the lines of, gee, we, the nations of the world, ought to eliminate barriers to trade, and we ought to encourage it between our companies and our consumers and our nations. That eventually developed into the World Trade Organization, which is just like the UN, the United Nations, which is a treaty between almost all the nations in the world. And the WTO acts as a court. It acts to adjudicate conflicts between nations over trade issues. On a regional level, many groups of nations have entered into free trade associations or customs unions. And the essential elements of those organizations are to say, we will permit the free trade, the free movement of goods, of labor, of capital across our borders without any heavy regulations, without heavy taxation. So, two of the ones that come to mind right away that you've probably heard of. One is Nafta, the North American Free Trade Agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And the signing of that permitted many American factories to open up plants in northern Mexico, where their goods were made more inexpensively. While the pay is lower in Mexico than in the United States, the reality is the income that those Mexican workers are getting is 4 to 5 times higher than they would have been making before NAFTA. And it means the goods being shipped back into the United States are less expensive for American consumers. So we buy more of that good at lower prices than before. The other organization you may have heard of is the European Union, which is an agreement between 26 or 27 nations in Europe to do the same thing. It actually goes a little further in that if you live in the Netherlands, you can work in Belgium without a green card. If you can immigrate from Austria to France without any obstacles in your way. It permits a much greater freedom of movement for goods and services. Now, there has been, in recent years, a pushback against this. The overall trend in the world is towards greater cooperation, greater globalization, and greater movement. There are hiccups along the way, and I think politically right now we're in one of those hiccup periods where people are talking about limiting the free movement of goods and services. One tool that's often used is a tariff. And a tariff is when the government, the US government, places a tax or a fee on goods coming into the United States from other countries. And of course, this has several ramifications. Even though it's often presented as if we are taxing the other nation or the company in the other nation, it really affects American consumers and not the other nation. And that's because if the other nation has to pay a tax to get their goods into the US, then they have to raise the price of their goods to cover that tax. And that means American consumers end up paying more for that good. And in essence, it's the American consumer who is actually paying that tax. It also means American businesses who are importing raw materials from outside the United States. Maybe as a small business you've chosen to import part of your raw materials. Now that's going to be a higher cost to you. And that in turn is going to end up being a higher cost to your customers. So the tariff is meant to punish or tax goods coming into the US. In reality, it hurts American businesses who are importing raw materials, and it hurts consumers who now have to pay more for that good. The same happens when we enact a quota on goods. Whereas a tariff is a tax on goods coming in, a quota is a limitation on the number of goods that can come in. So we may say to a country, you can send us your widgets, but we're going to limit it to 1 ton of widgets per year. Well, by restricting supply, you of course raise the price of that good in the marketplace because there's fewer of them available. So there's been this push recently for government to enact tariffs or quotas or to interfere with the free movement of goods and services. Now, excuse me, there are those who will say, well, wait a second. Doesn't it help American businesses if you don't allow cheap goods to come in from other countries. And that's a very common protectionist argument that you hear. So let me give you a very specific example to show how in the long run it actually hurts. Steel is one of those industries in the United States that is often loses out to competition from steel made in other countries. So let's say under free trade, I can walk into a department store and buy a tricycle for a young child for $50 because that steel is fairly inexpensive. Maybe it came in from Mexico. So I have $100 in my pocket and I spend $50 on that tricycle from Mexico. Now I have another $50 to spend on many other goods. If we enact a tariff or a quota, if we restrict the import of Mexican steel, and now I go to that same store and I want to buy that same tricycle, but now it costs me $100. I pay $100 for it and I go home with my tricycle, but how much money do I have left in my pocket? Zero. And that means I have $50 less to spend on other businesses, whether it be a florist or a restaurant or a deli or an antique store, doesn't really matter. I no longer have it because I had to pay more for that good that had a tariff slapped on it. So while the 0.5% of Americans who work in the steel industry might be helped by a tariff on foreign steel, 100% of the consumers in America are hurt by that increase in price that they now see. And it means that 100% of consumers who are buying products that include steel have less money to spend on in all the other businesses in the United States. And in fact, one of the industries that was hit hard when we did put tariffs on steel coming in from abroad was the auto industry, because so much of the auto industry relies on steel inputs. So they ended up having to pay more for the inputs for the autos they were making. And that meant they either had to deal with a lower profit or they had to raise the price of the good in the marketplace. And when you raise the price of a good in the marketplace, the quantity demanded of that good falls and you have fewer sales. So we have this overall movement towards a global free trade scenario with the World Trade Organization and with free trade associations and customs unions, with the ability of people to buy things on the internet legally or illegally, and having goods cross borders. That is the trend and the direction the world is going. Along the way, there are these hiccups as governments say we're moving too fast, or let's pull this back a little, or let's try and regulate this a little. And then you have small businesses who are kind of caught in the middle of the globalization wave and a little bit of pullback here and there. But as I said, there's many ways to use the opportunities and the challenges to your advantage as a small business, by taking advantage of inexpensive raw materials, by taking advantage of global markets, by marketing yourself or positioning yourself in a way that says, hey, I got a high quality product because it's all local made, so be willing to pay the higher price for my good in my market. Many, many different ways to adjust. The one thing the small business has got to be able to do is to be able to follow the trends and to be able to engage in flexible decision making so that they're always ahead of the curve and not trying to play catch up. This has been a brief overview of globalization. I actually do have 3 additional videos that I use in my macroeconomics class, specific to theories of free trade, specific to the effects of protectionism, and specific to the impact of currency fluctuations, which we haven't addressed in this video. And if you're interested in any of them, I can always send them to you. But this provides you with a good basis for understanding today's small business in the context of a global business environment. Thank you. That's Tom Simmons signing off.